Professor Motamedi, I understand that you focus your research on the Gilded Age.
Yes, specifically the technological aspects of the Gilded Age.
Will you please introduce us to the Gilded Age?
The Gilded Age was a period from the 1870s to the 1900s in which many influential inventions, technological advances, and numerous changes to the landscape of the United States would be seen forever.
Such as?
Some of the inventions: the train changed transportation, enabling people to travel long distances they weren't able to before. The telegraph gained prominence and changed communication forever. The invention of the light bulb that we depend on to light our homes, our businesses, and our streets, those were all invented during the Gilded Age.
There seem to be so many inventions. Out of all of them, which personally do you think is the most important one?
What I consider to be the most important invention was the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell is a personal hero of mine because of what he did and his inventions. The way he made that phone and what the phone did is truly awe-inspiring.
The telephone is still used today and more than ever. Who or what was greatly impacted by the invention of the telephone?
The telephone impacted the lives of women, improved the communication between businesses over long distances, and led to the telecommunication services that shape the cellular world today.
So how exactly was the telephone invented?
On May 18, 1915, Thomas A. Watson gave a speech. In the speech, How Bell Invented the Telephone, Watson recalls the first time Bell explained his idea of a mechanism that would later develop to be the telephone.
I could make a current of electricity vary in its intensity, precisely as the air varies in density during the production of a sound. I should be able to transmit speech telegraphically.
After numerous tests and prototypes, Bell had successfully brought his idea to fruition.
One more scoop there. Almost done. All right. Mr. Watson? Come quickly. I want to see you.
Did Bell face any difficulties involving his invention?
Yes, in fact he did. While the telephone is usually considered to be Bell's invention, he had to work hard to patent it. Another inventor named Elisha Gray had his own idea of a telephone that competed with Bell's. On February 14, 1876, Gray and Bell both submitted patents for harmonic telegraphs to use for transmitting vocal sounds. They both turned in their patent on the same day within a few hours of each other. The patent office then would begin to determine who invented the telephone first.
So going back to the impacts of the telephone, you mentioned how women's lives were impacted. What exactly did you mean by that?
When the telephone was first invented, women were not treated as well as they are now. For the majority of the 19th century, women were treated unfairly under the law, and there were many restrictions on their freedoms. It wasn't until the ratification of the 19th Amendment that women were granted political freedoms, but they still had a long way to go for economic and social freedoms. At the beginning of World War I, many men left their skilled jobs behind to participate in the war. This created opportunities for women to begin joining the workforce. Women did have a huge influence in the general workforce, as they were usually employed in farming, industrial, and domestic work. Bell's invention changed this by giving women the opportunity to join the professional workforce and be working members of society.
I'm guessing there was some specific type of job that was made for women in response to the telephone.
In fact, there was. Once the telephone began to be widespread and many American households and businesses began to use them, the need for a telephone operating emerged. This telephone operator would connect calls to where they wanted to go and also end the call when it was done. There were switchboards that controlled all the calls going in and out of that area. This was the first time that women had a major job in society. This job was one of the main reasons that women could have a job in society.
I see you brought a picture.
Yes. This picture was taken in New York in 1902 once women started working as telephone operators. In order to get a job, women had to pass height, weight, and arm length tests. The women who worked as operators were kept under strict supervision to ensure they were acting appropriately. A former operator, Mary McGrath, recalls, "No talking. Don't dare look around." Although women had to follow the strict rules, this job gave them the experience of working. The job managed to bring women out of the private sphere and into the public sphere. They went from being simple housewives to having an important job in society. From 1900 to 1910, the percentage of all women in the labor force increased from 20.4 to 25.2% due to the beginning of World War I, where many men had left their skilled jobs to participate in the war, leaving open positions for women to take. Overall, from 1900 to 1930, the percent increased from 20.4 to 24.3 due to women establishing a position in the workforce. although from 1910 to 1920 there was a decrease in the percentage from 25.2 to 23.3 because some of the men who came back from the war had taken their old jobs back. This was finally a job that women could have that men simply couldn't do. This job gave women a first-hand experience of being in the professional world, which opened their eyes to a whole new way of living. These experiences showed women that they could be more than just housewives and could be productive members of society.
What other impacts did the telephone have for people?
Like I said earlier, the telephone also impacted the way businesses were able to communicate over large distances.
What do you mean by that?
So before the telephone, businesses and large companies had to communicate mostly through letters and telegraphs. If two businesses that were across the country had to make a major deal between each other, they had to wait a few days for the letter to get there, or they had to wait for the telegraph to finish writing the message. This could lead to errors between the two recipients. A company called Randall Cook & Company once made their wool priced at 40 cents a pound. The telegraph operator made a mistake and put 45 cents a pound, leading to no one wanting to buy from them.
So the telephone definitely made communication between the businesses a lot easier.
Without a shadow of a doubt, no longer did people have to wait to make their deals or talk to each other. They could now simply pick up their phone and call the company they needed to talk to. Everything was so much simpler. Deals could be made with a snap of a finger, or in this case, a few dials on their telephone.
Do you happen to have any pictures of companies using the telephone once it was first invented?
Of course I do. So this picture has a perfect example of businesses using the telephone. The offices and the businesses seem to all have the equipment necessary to make calls to each other so that work could get done. That phone there must have been used to communicate to other businesses, which was the main use of the telephone at the time.
So you believe that the telephone changed the business landscape, correct?
Yes, definitely. Before the telephone, ways of communicating were rather slow. In fact, the actual patent for the telephone and the battle between Bell and Gray is a great example of how life and communication was before the telephone.
I'd like to register this patent.
I'd like to register this patent.
Bell had registered the invention 2 hours before Gray. If communication was like it is today, it might have been a different story. The telephone added vast communication to the world, which changed the landscape of how we do things politically, socially, and economically.
Can you elaborate on how it changed the landscape in this way?
Well, economically, the telephone added a lot to the general workforce and made it easier for businesses to communicate as a whole. Being able to talk to one another no matter where you are in the world adds a lot of economic opportunities. Politically, world leaders could talk to one another no matter where they were. In fact, the government was the first to want the telephone in their buildings and even spent over $50,000 on developing a device like Bell's, something that could transmit and receive messages using the atmosphere. In fact, when the first transcontinental call was made, it was earth-shattering. The day was January 25th, 1915. Watson was in San Francisco and Bell in New York. The call was the first of many calls that would be made from all over the world.
Wow, that must have been quite the battle between Gray and Bell.
Oh, it was, and it didn't stop there. Soon after the patent was passed, two different companies emerged to be the major competitors in telecommunication services. This shaped the cellular world. In fact, do me a favor, pull out your phone.
Okay.
Now look at the top left-hand corner. What do you see?
My service and AT&T.
Aha, AT&T. Do you know what that stands for?
I can't say I do.
I'll enlighten you. AT&T stands for American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Where did this company come from? The Bell Telephone Company, created by none other than Alexander Graham Bell.
I never knew that.
Well, yeah. The Bell Company became one of the most used cellular providers in the nation. Like today, there were competing telecommunication companies vying for supremacy. Like AT&T versus Verizon, there was the Bell Company versus Western Union Telegraph. And guess who was the brain for the Western Union Telegraph? Elisha Gray. He even had Thomas Edison helping him. There was even a court case where the judge ruled that Bell had the patent and was allowed to have his own company. So you had two of the most well-known inventors of the 19th century working against each other, sorta like the Steve Jobs versus Bill Gates of our generation.
So not much has changed from then to now.
Nope. The telephone impacted the cellular world today and shaped it to what it is like now. Quite the story, isn't it?
It really is. Well, we're coming to the end of our time together, Professor. Is there anything else you would like to talk about?
I'll leave you with this. The Gilded Age was a time of many inventions and changes to the landscape of the modern world. Inventions like the train, telegraph, and the light bulb were just some of the highlights of the age. However, the telephone was the Gilded Age's magnum opus. It truly revolutionized how businesses communicate and operate. It affected the workforce as well, by giving people, especially women of the Gilded Age, more jobs and opportunities. Unlike many of the other inventions of the Gilded Age, the phone is still prevalent today and more widespread than ever. That is why I believe the telephone's impact shaped the cellular world we live in today.
Okay. Thank you for finding the time to come and sit with us today, Professor.